My topic is related to the Ukrainian Vatican relations and the Vatican's approach to the Russian aggression and Russian-Ukrainian war. You see that this is a very hot topic because just online we see and live we see the visits of Cardinal Matteo Zuppi, first to Kiev and a few days ago to Moscow. And it's a very discussed topic, and I will mention a little bit about it. So, but first, I prepared my notes and some points that I wanted to focus on, and then I think we will have a discussion about this topic. So I'm starting, yes, with my lecture. If you will have any questions during my lecture, please interrupt me, don't hesitate, and I will answer or explain something that is not clear from my text. The discussion about the Vatican's position in the context of Russian aggression against Ukraine began long before the start of the open Russian invasion. Already in February 2015, the words of Pope Francis, who called Russia's proxy aggression in Donbass a fratricidal war, caused surprise and even outrage among Ukrainian Catholics of both rights, and also in the wider cycles of Ukrainian society. Many understood the hermeneutics of the Pope, who considers every war a form of a fratricide, but in general, Ukrainian society read this and many of Pontiff's subsequent statements within the context of how the Kremlin interpreted the events in Donbass. The latter tried to portray the conflict in eastern Ukraine as a civil war to avoid a responsibility for the outbreak of bloodshed. Thus, on May 5th of the same year, Patriarch Kirill of Moscow praised the Vatican's position, saying that, quotation, Pope Francis and the Holy See's Secretary of State have taken a considerate position on the situation in Ukraine, avoiding unilateral assessments and calling for an end to the fratricidal war. No less emotional discussions occurred in the context of the other Vatican initiatives related to Russia's actions against Ukraine. The meeting between the Pope and the Patriarch in Cuba the following year and the document released further strengthened Ukraine's critical mood toward the Vatican. The so-called Havana Declaration, which was perceived in the world as a breakthrough in ecumenical dialogue, was negatively assessed in Ukraine, as it allowed Russian propaganda to continue to present the situation in Donbass as a civil war, and they used the authority of the pontiff to do so. In the eyes of Ukrainians, the meeting between the pontiff and Patriarch Kirill only legitimized the rhetoric of the Moscow Patriarchate. The Pope's white cassock helped whitewash Moscow's reputation, which launched a proxy war against Ukraine. One crucial detail is worth noting here. Ukrainians do not mind contacts between the Vatican and Moscow if they discuss issues that concern the two sides. What outrages Ukrainians is a conversation about them without them. Ukrainians are convinced that Ukraine cannot be the subject of the negotiations between the Vatican and Moscow, as has happened in Havana airport. Despite all, due to the hybrid nature of the ongoing war in Donbass, the principle of positive neutrality that the Vatican adheres to in the cases of interstate conflicts did not cause as much negative emotions as it did after February 24th. On the contrary, shortly before Russia's open invasion of Ukraine, Ukrainian politicians and Catholic Church representatives sought to involve the Vatican as a mediator in negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. They expressed hope for the pontiff's visit to Ukraine, which, in opinion of many, could draw the world's attention to Ukraine and thus prevent the war. The Vatican, in turn, made urgent appeals to the international community and participants in the Normandy format to prevent a possible escalation and invasion, of course. On February 23rd, 2022, just hours before the full-scale attack, the Pontiff proclaimed Ash Wednesday, it was March the 2nd, a day of prayer and fasting for peace in Ukraine. It should be noted that before, the trust in Pope Francis remained high in Ukrainian society. According to the leading Ukrainian think tank Razumkov Center, in 2020, he was ahead of all religious leaders inside and outside the country. 45% of Ukrainian citizens trusted him. By comparison, the Patriarch of Moscow was trusted only 15% according to this survey. Given that about 70% of Ukrainian citizens declared their affiliation with Orthodoxy and only 10% are Catholics, this statistics is very telling. The dynamics of the decline in the moral authority of the Moscow Patriarch in Ukraine clearly shows that its collapse occurred with the beginning of Russia's proxy war against Ukraine in 2014. For Ukrainians, the Bishop of Rome was and is first and foremost the world's moral authority. This is due not only to the personality of the current pontiff, but also to previous popes, especially Saint John Paul II, who was not only one of the protagonists of the overthrow of communism in Eastern Europe, a critic of Soviet totalitarianism, but also personally visited Ukraine in 2001 and inspired Ukrainians to continue moving toward rapprochement with other European nations. And he also beatified 28 martyrs of the Soviet totalitarianism. Therefore, on February 24th, the day of the open Russian invasion of Ukraine, Ukrainians expected unequivocal and explicit support from the Apostolic See and condemnation of the aggressor. The first reaction from the Vatican to the beginning of the open Russian invasion was a brief statement by Cardinal Pietro Parolin, Secretary of State, who noted that Pope Francis was saddened by the deterioration of the situation and recalled the words of the Pontiff the day before that the parties must refrain from any action that could cause further sufferings to the population, destabilizing coexistence between peoples and discrediting international law. He also expressed hope for a glimmer of conscience from those who hold the fate of the world in their hands. And he also called for negotiations that he believed could protect the legitimate aspiration of everyone, it was a quotation, and save, quotation, the world from the madness of horrors of war. Along with the most cautious language, Cardinal Parolin avoided using the words aggression or invasion, and instead used words from the Russian propaganda dictionary about Russian special military operation on the territory of Ukraine. In turn, Pope Francis, departing from the diplomatic protocol, visited the Russian embassy to the Apostolic See on February 25th, where he expressed his concern about the events in Ukraine. He called the head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, His Beatitude Sviatoslav Shevchuk, and the Ukrainian president, whom he assured of his support, and during the Sunday Angelus prayer expressed his solidarity with those who suffered. In the following weeks and months, the Vatican's rhetoric on what was happening in Ukraine constantly changed. On March the 2nd, Pope Francis called the events in Ukraine a war. Vatican's rhetoric became stricter after the Russian bombing of maternity hospital in Mariupol. On March the 10th, the front page of the official Vatican newspaper, El Osservatore Romano, featured a photo of pregnant women running out of the destroyed building with a sarcastic caption, Operazione Militare Speciale, special military operation. It was like a very sarcastic a caption, because pregnant women were on the front page. On March 13, the Pope called the events in Ukraine unacceptable armed aggression and massacre. And then, during his regular apostolic exhortation, Pontiff used the words armed aggression. And on March 27th, he used the word invasion. In other respects, the Vatican has consistently followed the line initiated by Cardinal Pietro Parolin on the first day of the war, calling on all sides to negotiate and standing in solidarity with those suffering from the war, without specifying sometimes who is suffering. In Ukraine, however, all these gestures from the Roman See were assessed as a half-hearted, as Vatican officials and the Pope himself avoided mentioning Russia and its president by name, limiting themselves to condemning the very fact of war and calling all the parties to come to the negotiation table. Because the Roman bishop was primarily a moral leader for most Ukrainians, as I said before, they expected him to make less diplomatic efforts and more direct condemnation of the aggressor, and explicit calls for Russia to stop the occupation of Ukrainian territories. Instead, the Vatican's policy of impartiality or positive neutrality in conflicts between countries looked to Ukrainians as an attempt to put an equal sign between the positions of Ukraine, which is forced to defend itself, which was forced to defend, still is forced to defend itself, and Russia, which has resorted to unprovoked aggression. In parallel with Pope's addresses during general audiences and Sunday sermons before the Angelus prayer, in which he mentioned Ukraine, there were also spontaneous comments by Pontiff. It should be noted that such direct and informal statements by Pope Francis on various topics have become a feature of this pontificate, and some of them have repeatedly provoked heated discussions within the Catholic Church, and not always about Ukraine. You can remember plenty of such discussions about his statements during flights or press conferences on the aircraft. In the context of Russian aggression, some of the Pope's spontaneous statements were no exception. To be fair, at some points, the Pope's departure from the official vocabulary could even amuse Ukrainian society, as was the case with the characterization of Patriarch Kirill of Moscow as a Putin's altar boy. But Pontiff's remarks about NATO's barking and doubts about the morality of supplying weapons to Ukraine caused a flurry of negative emotions in Ukrainian society. The scenario of last year's Good Friday procession of the cross, where Ukrainian and Russian women who has been living in Italy for many years and working together in a local hospice, carrying the cross during the you remember this during the 13th station, caused no less outrage. It should be noted, however, that the debate over the Vatican's position on Russian aggression against Ukraine is not limited to Ukrainian society or Ukrainian Catholics. It has brought to the surface topics that concerns the entire Catholic Church, such as the doctrine of just war and the question of the Vatican's impartiality and or positive neutrality concerning conflicts between states. Another issue that arises in the context of the Russian invasion is the possible impact on the Vatican's position of the so-called Ostpolitik, or Eastern policy of the Vatican, or attempt to maintain relations with Moscow and the Moscow Patriarchate at all costs by avoiding direct verbal confrontation with President Putin or Patriarch Kirill. There is no doubt that the Vatican is sincerely sympathetic to Ukrainians, and we know this from the more than 150 speeches the Pope has given on Ukraine. However, there was no shortage of unfortunate moments. And I would like to focus on a few key ones and go a little bit deeper. The act of consecration of Ukraine and Russia to the Immaculate Heart of the Virgin Mary was received with mixed feelings in Ukraine. Even though this initiative came from the Ukrainian Roman Catholic bishops, they had made such an act concerning Ukraine on the first day of the war. And essentially repeated the similar action by Pope Pius XII, who in 1942 dedicated the entire world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. It was not met with a sincere enthusiasm among Ukrainian Catholics of both rites, nor in the wider Ukrainian society. In the eyes of many, it followed the same logic of equalizing of moral responsibility for the outbreak of war on both sides. It undermined the just nature of Ukrainian resistance in the eyes of Ukrainian society. However, perhaps the most controversial in Ukraine was the scenario of the 13th station of the Way of the Cross on Good Friday in 2022, during which Ukrainian, as I mentioned, and Russian women were carrying the cross. In the eyes of Ukrainian society, the gesture of reconciliation proposed by the Vatican blurred the distinction between the victim and the aggressor. Instead, true reconciliation is possible only after the war ends and peace, just peace, is established, and the offender admits his guilt. That's why, a short time after the Station of the Cross scenario was made public, a powerful wave of outrage in society prompted the head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church to address the Roman See with a statement in which he characterized the idea as untimely and called the text and gestures of the 13th station incoherent and even offensive to Ukrainian people. At the last minute, this scenario was changed, not least because there were because these were the days when horrific photos and videos from the liberated towns near Kyiv became known in the whole world, and the facts of the brutal massacre of civilians by Russian military were revealed, and where the Pope's envoy, Cardinal Konrad Krajewski, arrived on the eve of Good Friday, and he witnessed by his own eyes what happened near Kiev and all these acts of massacre and even genocide, I will call it like in this way. However, while all of these discussions were mostly about the Vatican's immediate responses to events in Ukraine, there were also a parallel discussion about the Vatican's Eastern policy in general. For Ukrainian Catholics, the term Ostpolitik has a mostly negative connotation, since its apogee, the peak, falls on the period when the Greek Catholic Church was underground in the Ukrainian lands, because the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was officially non-existent in the Soviet Union. It was liquidated on the pseudo-sobor, and all the property was given to the Russian Orthodox Church. So the term Ostpolitik was the most negative connotation, since its peak falls on the period of when the Greek Catholic Church was underground, because church existed only in catacombs in the Ukrainian lands. And its communities scattered around the world in diaspora were fighting for the creation of the Ukrainian Patriarchate and the recognition of this status by the Vatican, which would unite the entire diaspora into a single structure, and thus the church could resist the disintegration processes. The goal of Vatican's Ostpolitik of that period, during this period, was to find a modus non moriendi for those Catholic communities that could still legally exist under the communist rule, as well as to establish an ecumenical dialogue with the Moscow Patriarchate. Soviet officials were ready to discuss some concessions for Latin Catholic communities or Roman Catholics, but they didn't want to hear anything about the possibility of reviving the Eastern Catholic churches, and particularly Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. Therefore, for Ukrainian Catholics, Ostpolitik was a policy of betrayal for the sake of achieving uncertain goals. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, many elements of the Vatican Eastern policy lost their relevance. But ecumenical dialogue with the Russian Orthodox Church remained a priority for Rome. However, Ostpolitik is a two-way street. as the Moscow Patriarchate also has its own goals in the Vatican, in the dialogue with the Vatican. One of which is to recognize the entire post-Soviet space as a canonical territory of the Russian Church, which is the Church's analog of Moscow's imperialist policy and neo-colonialism. In the context of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, the question of the Vatican's priorities in Eastern Europe has been raised in Ukraine with renewed vigor. In the eyes of many Ukrainian Greek and Roman Catholics, Rome's attempt to continue to maintain close contacts with the Moscow Patriarchate or to plan a new meeting with Patriarch Kirill, who blessed the armed aggression against the neighboring state, it looks like a revival of the worst aspects of the old Ostpolitik. In the broader context, Ukrainian society expects to deepen ecumenical contacts with the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which received a Thomas of Autocephaly from the Patriarch of Constantinople in 2019, and to which the majority of the country's Orthodox population now declares its affiliation. According to many observers, the presence of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine in the ecumenical movement, which has long been in a complete shadow of Moscow, can give the Orthodox Catholic dialogue a new life. Another question that raised a lot of discussions in Ukraine where the principle was a principle of the positive neutrality of the Vatican. Russia's aggression against Ukraine is very similar to the situation with the German invasion of Poland in 1939, and in many aspects the Vatican's reaction to it is no exception. On the eve of the German invasion of Poland, the Vatican tried to mediate between the two countries to prevent war, even as at the expense of the territorial concessions from the Poles, as Pius XII believed that the war would in any case cause Poland much more harm. And after the German invasion, in his encyclical Summi Pontificatus, Supreme Pontificate of the October 20th, 1939, the pontiff, without naming the aggressor, briefly mentioned peoples plunged into the maelstrom of war and expressed solidarity and sympathy for the Polish people. Both the diplomatic activity of the Apostolic See on the eve of the war and the Pope Pius XII's restrained reaction to the open aggression provoked a wave of disappointment in Polish society. On the other hand, the position of the Apostolic See gave German propaganda a wide scope for manipulation. After the war, in his Christmas message of 1948, Pius XII emotionally emphasized that in case of unjust aggression, quotation, the solidarity of the family of nations forbids others to behave as mere spectators, showing impassive neutrality, adding that it is impossible to measure the damage, quotation, already done by in the past by such indifference to wars of aggression. And such an attitude, quotation, only reassured and emboldened the authors and instigators of aggression. During the Second World War, the Vatican certainly didn't behave purely as a spectator and did not remain indifferent to wars and aggression, but its position of impartiality, at least from the outside, looked like a dispassionate neutrality. Despite these words of Pius XII, the approach of the Apostolic See in cases of military aggression has not changed, and his successors, including Pope Francis, continues to follow this line. On the other hand, it is worth noting that the rhetoric of the current pontiff has its own positive dynamics. While in the first weeks of the war, he more consistently followed the line of Pius XII, in his message on the Sixth World Day of the Poor, he characterized Russian aggression as a direct invasion of a superpower that intends to impose its will in defiance of the principle of the self-determination of peoples. At first glance, these changes are significant, but none of his recent predecessors have come so close to directly identifying the aggressor. This, however, did not fully satisfy Ukrainian society. For Ukrainians, the pontiff desired to avoid accusations that he is a chaplain of the West or chaplain of NATO looks fair, but it is not clear why the moral assessment of the aggressor's actions and calling him by name is the right and duty of the so-called global West and not of the Church of Christ. Summing up, while Pope Francis has spoken about the war in Ukraine frequently and expressed his solidarity with its people, many Ukrainians have said that said that they expected him to unequivocally condemn Russia's action and crimes of the Russian army in Ukraine, and have seen the war began expressed frustration with the Pope's approach to the conflict in the region. Now, with the papal peace envoy visited Kiev and Moscow, local Catholics predicted Cardinal Matteo Zuppi may find it hard to convince Ukrainians that he understands the nature of the conflict. Ongoing Ukrainian disappointment with the Holy See's gestures and Francis' words is reflected in plummeting levels of trust in popes among the Ukrainians. As I told you before, 45% of Ukrainians trusted Pontiff in 2020. So Ukrainians then consider Francis the world's most trusted religious leader. And in May 2023, only 3%, according to the leading Ukrainian think tanks, Razumkov Center, trusted Pope. Razumkov data show that more than half of Ukrainians now have a negative opinion of Pope Francis' stance on Russian aggression against Ukraine, believing that he equates the suffering of Ukrainians to that of Russians. About 10% of Ukrainians believe the Pope is acting in interest of the Kremlin, and only 9% support the Pope's desire to end the war at any cost. Not surprisingly, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had said that Ukraine doesn't need Vatican's mediation after he visited Rome in May. The president's statements reflect the wider attitude of Ukrainian society. The Ukrainian media have been skeptical about the Pope's recent peace initiatives, including a June visit, to Ukraine by Cardinal Zuppi in June, and also his recent visit to Moscow. And contrary to the musings of close papal advisors like Stefano Zamani, the Catholic bishops of Ukraine have consistently emphasized that Ukraine needs a just peace, not just an end to hostilities at any cost. More broadly, Ukrainian Catholics have little hope in the peace initiatives of the Holy See, and many say their skepticism is because they believe the Vatican lacks of understanding of both the causes of the war and Russia's goals in it. Cardinal Zuppi's recent statements, when he said that, quotation, there is an aggressor and there is a victim, therefore responsibility must not be confused. Peace must be safe, and it must be a real peace, and one that can lead to the reconstruction of not only what has been destroyed, but above all to coexistence. Such words give some hope for Ukrainians. However, it remains unclear what the Vatican means by just peace when it comes to Ukraine. For Ukrainians who are victims of this war, which already has signs of genocide, a just peace means not only the liberation of all the territory that was occupied in violation of the international law, but also the punishment of the perpetrators and aggressors. This may be one of the main reasons why the Vatican's constant call for dialogue without direct condemnation and shaming of the aggressor are perceived in Ukraine with skepticism. Of course, post-war Europe was built on dialogue. I mean the post-Second World War. Post-war Europe was built on dialogue, and an important cornerstone was a recognition of the other and the recognition of his right on his position. In such a situation, each side would have to be heard, and thus a compromise could be found. But what to do when a when one party to a dialogue is dishonest participant who constantly lies. We must recognize that Putin has essentially hacked this culture of dialogue and is skillfully manipulating it. Does the truth also lie somewhere in the middle? In Ukraine, we used to say that, as the Polish intellectual Adam Michnik, who knows what Russian imperialism and totalitarianism, not from books, he knows it very well because he lived under this totalitarianism. He once said that the truth does not lie in the middle, it lies where it lies.